All right. Good morning. Hey, if I haven't had a chance to meet you yet, my name is Dan, and I'm the lead pastor here at the Alliance. And I'm excited that you've joined us today as we're talking about how we develop resilient relationships, healthier relationships, not just in friendships and marriages, but maybe even bleeding over into our workplaces and into the general community. We want to have healthy, strong relationships wherever we go. I remember one particular relationship I had when I was in a youth pastor role in Michigan, and I met a young guy who wanted some direction as he was stepping into a very, very part-time role at another church. And he was looking for some guidance and some mentoring, and so we had a conversation about that, and I offered. I said, hey, you know what, I believe in you, I believe in what you're doing, and I'd love to be helpful in answering questions as you go. We had met several times, and he had just been asking me questions, and I thought, well, let's walk together forward in this. And I remember the first formal time I came to his office to talk about things as he was getting started in this new role in kids ministry and youth. I remember walking into his office, and one of the first things he asked me is, he said, hey, I got a question for you. I need help figuring something out, and I don't know what to do about it. I have this conversation that's ongoing with my lead pastor, and as I'm starting this role, I need help determining which title I should have. I think I should have this title, and I don't remember exactly what he said, something about youth and families and all of this, and he was like, I think it should be this title. My senior pastor thinks it should be this title, but I just don't think that communicates the importance of the position. And I remember feeling so weird about the question, this is the question you want to ask? We have time together, and this is, you want me to pick a title for you. Okay. And so I remember just kind of being caught off guard by that just a little bit, and I said, hey, we need to just pause for a second before we continue on. There was a pretty insignificant difference between these two titles, I remember, and just thinking, there's something deeper going on. And I said, what are you going to be doing? And he explained it to me, and I said, what difference will the title make to what you're doing? And he was like, well, I guess I'm going to do the same thing either way. And I said, exactly. So what is this title really about? He said, well, I guess if I'm being honest, I want people to see that I'm important. I was like, okay, there we go. Now we have something to talk about. You see, he was seeing his title as in some way leveraging power in the relationships that he was going to have. Now, it might not be a specific title, but truthfully, we do that not just in work, but in any role. We're kind of obsessed with titles. They might even be unspoken titles. They might be highly spiritualized titles, like head of the household. We love titles because we want to know where we fit into relationship with others. We want to know who has power in the relationship. Now, one thing I know for sure is you want to ruin a relationship, mess up your power dynamics. Power, even just a little bit of power, will royally mess up a relationship. Because the best relationships don't have power over. Those are not the kind of relationships we want to have. The best kind of relationships are ones that are mutually loving and caring for one another. Now, you might be thinking, that's not present in any of my relationships. Outside of work, I don't care about titles. But all of us have power dynamics in our relationship. There's a psychiatrist, Emily Hurd, who has identified 3 different kind of couplets and responses in ways we leverage power. And it might not seem like power, but we're going to put these up on the screen. And the first one is the demand-withdrawal power dynamic. Demand could be from one side of the relationship where somebody is asking for a lot, and it might not be a lot in terms of quality. It might be just a lot of touch points on asking for things, okay? Somebody is asking a lot from you. Well, the response in the limited power that you might have in that relationship is simply to withdraw. You can't change what somebody else is asking from you, but you can put distance between yourself. You can withdraw and you can create distance in a relationship. That's one way we flex power. Now, all three of these are not comprehensive in terms of how we experience power in our relationships, but the next one that Hurd explains is the distancer pursuer. If somebody is creating distance or you feel like a sense of distance in a relationship, we can very easily become the pursuer. I've been there before, like I've been in a relationship where I'm the pursuer. There's an odd amount of satisfaction about being the pursuer. Like you feel good about it. If it works out, you're like, that's because of me. And there is a truthful reality of that. But in some of the power dynamics in relationships, if there's distance, one of the ways we leverage power is by pursuing. And that can be a good thing. And the final one is fear and shame. If there's fear or insecurity in a relationship, shame can be a very powerful tool. And we might not mean to wield it, but it happens in small, subtle ways, like when we remind somebody else of a mistake they've made. These are all simple, small ways that don't necessarily have to deal with title, but it puts us in the position of power in a relationship. Now, if you want a relationship where somebody is dominated by you, you should probably pursue that. I don't want a relationship that is dominated by power. I want a relationship that is strong, and I believe resilient relationships tackle head-on these power dynamics. And what's more than that, if we pay attention to the teachings of Jesus, we're going to find out that he helps us in these kind of situations and teaches us, walks us through these power dynamics. We're going to be turning in Scripture to Luke chapter 22. If you want to follow along in your Bible, you can. You can Google it on your phone, open up the Bible app. It'll also be on the screen above. But in Luke chapter 22, we'll be reading verses 24 through 27. Now, as we step into it, I want to give you just kind of a quick layout. We're going to be hopping into the middle of a story, and this story is that Jesus has been gathering with his disciples, celebrating the Passover meal. And the Passover meal was an annual celebration of God's deliverance of Israel in the book of Exodus from oppression in Egypt, slavery in Egypt. And God delivered them out. And ever since, every single year, they have been celebrating this Passover meal. And now we have generations later, we have Jesus gathered around the table celebrating God's deliverance of Israel. And then in the midst of it, Jesus, before and even after, starts talking about how he is going to be God's deliverance for his people. And at this deep, intimate moment, the disciples have maybe what might be the most inappropriate conversation that you could have in this moment. I love how awkward the disciples are. It makes me feel so much better about myself as I follow Jesus. I'm like, Jesus, like it seems like it was a standard qualification for everybody who followed you that they're really awkward and have poor timing. I'm in. Like, this is me. I'm in the story. So we pick up this story here in verse 24. A dispute arose among them as to which of them was considered to be greatest. Jesus said to them, the kings of the Gentiles lord it over them, and those who exercise authority over them call themselves benefactors. But you are not to be like that. Instead, the greatest among you should be like the youngest, and the one who rules like the one who serves. For who is greater, the one who is at the table or the one who serves? Is it not the one who is at the table? But I am among you as one who serves. The disciples decide to have this conversation in a deep, profound moment. And I don't know how they got here. I don't know how this dispute arose. I don't know how they got into arguments, but they had spent a considerable amount of time together. They had been, at this point in Jesus' ministries, the disciples had been following Jesus for approximately 3 years. And scholars believe that out of that 3 years, Jesus and his disciples spent a year and a half, solidly, half of that time together in everyday life. Have you ever had too much time with a friend? And you're like, I love you so much, and because I love you, I just can't be around you anymore. I remember having sleepovers when I was younger with my best friend, and we would like hang out, and I'm like, you're my best friend, like we're gonna hang out all the time, and then 2 days into it, I'm like, we should hang out less. Like maybe we should probably start seeing other people. Like I need other friends. And like that's what happens when you spend too much time together. So I don't know if we're seeing some of those relational dynamics, but at some point in this meal, Jesus is talking about God's deliverance. They're celebrating the most significant time of the year for God's people, for Israel, and they start arguing about who's better than the rest. Seems fitting, right? But they're sitting around the table, and for some reason, we read in verse 24 that a dispute arises among them, and they're arguing about who is the greatest. They start vying for position. Now, maybe it's because Jesus had said a lot of things leading up to this point about the coming of his kingdom. God's kingdom was coming, and in so many ways, actually in the most clear ways, God's kingdom is present and recognizable in the ministry of Jesus. And Jesus talks a lot about the kingdom, about how God wants to rule among people and how that rule and reign looks. Most of the time, it looked like forgiveness, mercy, freedom, grace, and healing. Sounds like a pretty good kingdom. Maybe it's in the context of that the disciples start thinking, okay, Jesus keeps talking more about this kingdom. He keeps talking about how things are getting closer. Maybe this kingdom is about to happen. Maybe we're the first recruits in the kingdom. Maybe when his government, this guy Jesus that we've been following, maybe when he sets up his government, we're going to be the top picks for the cabinet or the Senate or whatever. Maybe that's the direction they're thinking, and they start thinking, well, what role would we have? And they start looking at each other, and they're like, now we're not friends anymore, we're competition. Who's going to be higher up? Who's going to be in charge of who? Who has had the greater following? Who has had the greater deeds? Who has served better? And who's going to be better in God's kingdom? Maybe that's how it arose, but however it came about, they get into this conversation about who's better. Who's going to be the leader? You know, our culture celebrates leadership more than it ever has. It's led to some really, really good things. I think more than ever, we need good leaders in the world around us, people who can lead others into following Jesus and exemplifying what it means to follow Jesus. Maybe in even really good ways, they thought, hey, I think I have capacity to do that. Well, Jesus hears about it. He's at the table with them. He knows what's going on. And he speaks into it. In verse 25, we read, Jesus said to them, the kings of the Gentiles lord it over them. Now, Gentiles, let's pause there. Gentiles is anybody who's not Jewish, okay? It meant the rest of the world. It meant every nation, every tribe, every tongue, every kingdom that wasn't a part of Israel. And so Jesus points to that society, basically the rest of the world, to all of the Gentiles, and Jesus speaks into that, and he says, you know how the Gentile world looks? You know how it operates? They have kings. Everybody understood kings. Everybody understood emperors. I've been reading in my personal time in Scripture. I'm going through 1 Samuel. And part of the book of 1 Samuel in the Old Testament of the Bible is a story about how Israel gets a king. They get their very first king. And in the process, before that, God had been leading through different people who could deliver Israel. Some of them were military leaders, some of them were prophets, some of them were priests. And right before Israel gets their king, they have somebody who's ruling over people in a sense, but maybe not the way in the organized fashion that we often think about. And his name was Samuel, and he was a priest, but he was also a prophet. And he would listen to the Lord, and he would pass on to people God's judgments and God's rules and God's decisions. And he would help people draw close to God. He would help them worship. And in the process, the people come to Samuel and they say, hey, we want a king. And so Samuel doesn't like that. Israel has never had a king. He's not sure what that means for Israel, so he brings it to the Lord. And the Lord speaks to Samuel and tells Samuel, they haven't rejected you as their leader. They've actually rejected me. I've been their king. I've been meeting all their needs, but they haven't followed me very well. So don't worry about it. They're not rejecting you. They're rejecting me. But what I do want you to do, don't shut it down. What I want you to do is I want you to explain very clearly what a king will do for them. Let them know that they can have their king, but one of the first things a king is going to do is he's going to start taxing them. He's going to tax everything. He's going to want some of their produce. He's going to want first fruits of their fields. And this isn't about worship. This isn't about what was already being required by tithing and things like that and ceremonial worship. This was above and beyond. The king was actually going to want what's first. So he's going to take that. And then on top of that, he's going to take your young men and he's going to put them in the military, and they're going to have to fight for him. It won't be a volunteer organization anymore. It won't be a call to arms and rally around God's purposes. It will be the king's conscription of troops. And on top of that, he's going to take young men and young women and he's going to make them servants in his kingdom. This is what a king does. So Samuel explains it to them, and they decide they still want a king. And this had happened for generations and thousands of years. Many kingdoms had gone by. Israel knows what a king does. And on top of that, they lived in a world of kings and emperors. They knew what a king does. And so Jesus points it out. He says, listen, the rest of the world operates with the kind of power that you guys are arguing about right now. You're arguing about who's going to be the greatest. Well, who is the greatest in the world around us? It's a king. They have the most power out of anybody else around them. And what do they do with that power? They use it to get what they want out of their kingdom. They force people into serving. They bend the will of others to get what they would like. That's what a king does. And then Jesus goes on to another position in society. He says, and those who exercise authority over them, meaning over other Gentiles and people in society as well, call themselves benefactors. Now, a benefactor, that might be a little bit of foreign knowledge, or we might not understand that very well, and that's understandable for us. We don't really use that terminology a whole lot, but it was an incredibly important thing in Gentile culture around the time of Jesus. People without political power or without governmental power would use their wealth and what status they did have in order to bless others. How insidious. Bless others. Why would that be a bad thing? Well, because there were many philosophers who wrote at the time that Jesus is speaking and that this is being written, that more than life itself, praise is coveted. Like having status in society, having the praise of others socially was more coveted and more desired than life itself. And those who used their wealth and status to bless people became what was known as a benefactor. It was an honorary title of significance in a society. Well, what's wrong with blessing people? Well, nothing's wrong with blessing people, but benefactors never actually blessed people. They bought people. They used their wealth and status to, quote unquote, bless somebody, and in response, the person who benefited was indebted to the benefactor. The person who was indebted to the benefactor had to not pay the gift back because there was usually, with the size of the gift, there was no way they could be paid back. So how were they indebted? Well, they had to give public praise and loyalty to their benefactor. Essentially, a benefactor was somebody who used their wealth and status to buy public praise because they weren't worth it on their own. Jesus says, listen, on one end of the spectrum, you have kings who have the most authority over anybody else. And they use their power in order to bend the will of others. And then you have benefactors who use what power they have as a resource, and they use it to buy people so that they can bend the will of others. This is how power works in relationships. Jesus says you're arguing about who's great. These are the greatest people in society. But what do they use their power for? What do they use their greatness for? You want to be great? Jesus says, I want you to be great too, but I don't want you to be great like that. In fact, in verse 28, Jesus says, but you are not to be like that. He's talking to his followers, those who would learn to live life the way Jesus lived his life. And he says, listen, if you follow me, you don't do that. The rest of the world will use power that way. The rest of the world will treat one another that way, but if you follow me, don't do that. That's not how we have relationship with one another. And then Jesus explains how it should work. In verse 26, he continues on, and he says, "Instead, the greatest among you should be like the youngest, and the one who rules like the one who serves." Jesus says, if you want to be great, I'm going to tell you how to be great. You need to become the youngest. I think there's many people today that would be like, I wouldn't mind getting a little younger. There's a way to do this? We've been looking for that. That's awesome. Jesus says, no, if you want to be great, you need to become like the youngest. Now, that's significant because the youngest in Jesus' society had no status, they had no resources, they had no wealth, they had no power. And so Jesus, in his standard way of speaking and doing things, does this huge role reversal and flips the whole dynamic on its head. He says, if you want to be great, you need to become like those who have no power. And then he says, he speaks to the lordship, that desire to be Lord. And he says, the one who is greater should be the one who is youngest, and the one who rules, if you want to rule, like the one who serves. Literally, you need to become a servant. If you want to rule over others, here's how you get there. Serve. You need to become like a servant. And again, a servant actually might be a little bit lower than somebody who is young. Not only do they have no wealth, not only do they have no status, not only do they have no power, but they are under somebody else's direction. It's another step lower than being young. And Jesus flips everything on its head. He says, you want to be great, you need to become young. You want to be Lord, you want to rule, you need to become a servant. And Jesus goes on from there in verse 27, and he gives an example. They're all sitting around the table. They know how society works. If you own the home, if you own the table, it is very common to have household staff, and household staff would do everything that wasn't fitting for a homeowner to do. They washed the feet, they served the dinner, and after all was said and done, the right and proper way that society functioned was after the needs of the household leader was met, they were met, and everybody was taken care of. Then the servant got to sit down and have their meal, but only when everything was done. Only when there was nothing else to do. And Jesus is sitting around the table with his followers. They're arguing about this, and he uses the table as an example. He says, who is greater, the one who is at the table or the one who serves? Now, this is very obvious to them. There's nothing to read into here. This was an obvious hypothetical thing, and they're thinking, of course, it's the one who's at the table. They own everything. They're the one deserving praise. They're the ones in the position of lordship, of power. And the one who serves has no rights. They're low on the totem pole, and Jesus says, you know this. He says, is it not the one who's at the table, but I am among you as one who serves. Now, they're all having this click. They're all seeing what is unfolding. They understand the dynamic of kings. They understand the dynamic of benefactors. They understand the dynamic of the table. From the greatest end down to the very lowest household end, Jesus is examining these relationships, and then he points to himself as an example. And the disciples know who is greater in that relationship. They know that Jesus is greater in that relationship. Not just because he's Jesus. If you know the story, you're like, of course, well, he's Jesus. He's, of course, greater. But anybody who would have been in Jesus' position in society would have been considered great. They would have had status. Jesus was a rabbi. That meant something in their society. He was honored. He was given deference. He was given priority in other people's invitations at how things were ordered around the table from greatest to least. Have you ever shown up at a dinner table and you're like, okay, I see what's going on here. That's the important end, and I got the kid table. Jesus would have always been at the head of the table. He would have always been in the most prominent position, and things were usually flowing from greatest to least around the table and giving honor to those who are greatest. And so Jesus asks them, he says, in our relationship, who's the greatest? And they would without a doubt say, of course you are, Jesus. It's your kingdom. You're the one who does amazing things. You're the one who has called us to learn from you. Of course you're greater. And Jesus says, yet I sit here not as one being served, but as one serving. Now this is just, in this book of Luke, it's just one account of this story. As you read other accounts of this story, you read that during this time, Jesus also took off his towel, or took off his garment, and he was down to just basically his undergarment, and he wraps a towel around himself, and he goes and does servant work. He goes around the table and he starts washing off all the mud from everybody's feet. He does the things that only the lowest of the house would do. He washes their feet and he serves them. Other times, in other places of the gospel, Jesus stood up and he told people, the Son of Man, and he uses that title to refer to himself. He says, the Son of Man has not come to be served, but to serve and give his life as a ransom for many. Not only has he come to serve, not only has he placed himself in the role of servitude, he has come to lay his life down for everybody. That's the level of service that Jesus points to. And now Jesus looks at his closest followers and he says, you really want to be great? You have to follow my example. Because your style of greatness is going to ruin every relationship you're in. Your desire for status is going to kill everything. It's not going to demonstrate the heart of God. It's going to demonstrate the heart of the world around you. You're not going to be any different than kings and benefactors. If you're truly about bending the will of your relationships to fulfill your own needs and desires, you're not going to develop a resilient relationship. Scholar and commentator David Garland speaks on this particular passage, and he points out this incredible truth. He says, the disciples are interested in titles. Who's going to be the greatest? Jesus offers them towels instead. Greatness is not determined by how many serve you, but how you serve others. I love that picture as Jesus gathers around the table with his followers and they're arguing about who's going to be the greatest. I imagine that if we had a timeline, I wonder if that's when Jesus got up, took off his outer garment, wrapped the servant's cloth around him, and went and washed feet. I don't know about you, but if I were one of the disciples at that moment and we were having that argument and that happened, I'd be like, I'm such an idiot. Like, I know where he's going with this. I see what's coming, Jesus. You got me. They're sitting around and they're talking about status. They're talking about what their title is going to be in the kingdom. And Jesus, in washing the disciples' feet, in Jesus as he teaches the disciples about what's the most important thing in relationships, and especially within relationships in God's kingdom. He asks them, who is the greatest, the one who serves or the one who is served? And they all know the answer, and then Jesus says, but I've served you. I've served you. And that's what we should be doing for other people. In fact, here's the invitation for Jesus. If we want to build resilient relationships, it's going to mean something for us. It means something about our status. It means something about our titles. And I love Garland's use of language in this, but this is the call of Jesus to you. Trade your title for a towel. You want a resilient relationship? You want stronger relationships? You have to start learning to trade your title for towels. Each of us has titles in every single relationship, but they don't serve the relationship, they serve us. I've never worked in a job where somebody who leveraged their positional authority over me just because they could was somebody that I really enjoyed being around. I've never enjoyed being in a relationship where somebody felt like they always had to be right, had to have the upper hand, and was always giving subtle brags about how good they were. I thought, I don't think this is the right relationship. All of us at some level are vying for position. All of us want to have great relationships at the same time. And Jesus would say, if you want to have a great relationship, if you want to be great, you need to trade any title, whatever that represents for you. You need to trade that title for a towel, and you need to start serving. If we want resilient relationships, we have to learn how to be people who serve. That is the way to true greatness. You can look at any great leader throughout history. And the difference between a great leader and a dictator is one who gets in the trenches with the people he leads and serves them and serves with them. And the dictator is the one who is separate. Jesus, the greatest leader of all, wraps a towel around himself. He has the title of Messiah, King of Kings, Lord of Lords, Son of God, Son of Man, Rabbi, Teacher, Prophet. And he trades all of those titles for towel. And he washes feet. And he says, this is how you're meant to treat one another. You want good relationships? You want healthy relationships? You want to bring the kingdom of God into your relationships? You have to learn how to serve. And every title gets in the way of those things. Every vying for position, every time we exert our authority because things aren't going our way. And this is a note, like maybe you're here this morning and you're not a follower of Jesus, or you just decided to come into church and you're not sure why. That's okay. All of these things that we're going to be sharing in how to build resilient relationships are going to be effective principles that you can carry into your relationships. But I want to take a moment right now and just address Christians in the room. I have heard the title, especially in marriages, head of the household, abused beyond what it's meant to be. And you need to stop. Because it's not compatible with Jesus' teaching. It's not. You're not always right. You're not always in charge. Jesus is. And he gave you the model of how to do it. That power dynamic is going to destroy your marriage. It's going to destroy your relationships. You won't have love and affection. You'll have subservient relationships. Those aren't resilient. Those are the relationships we look to get out of at the first possible trouble. But all of us, regardless of where our theology lies, regardless of what we believe about Jesus, all of us can learn to build more resilient relationships through serving. And I believe all of us can learn to serve in a few different ways. And I want to give you a few. They're not progressional. They don't build on one another. These are 3 simple ways that all of us can serve. And the first simple way we can serve is learning to ask more about them than they do about you. Ask more about them, whoever them is. Ask more about others than they ask about you. There's somebody that I run into in the community. He's in another church. He's on staff at another church. And I love spending the little bits of random time that I get with this individual, because I'll tell you what, I don't ever remember what he says to me, but I always leave the conversation feeling pretty good. And I recognize that through the process, it's because he's just always asking about me. Now, I don't like being the person who likes talking about themselves, but all of us enjoy these relationships where other people ask about us and they check in on us. Who doesn't love that? It makes us feel seen, it makes us feel heard, it makes us feel cared for. But what I also realized about this individual is the only time he spoke about himself is if I asked him something about himself. Now, I've talked with plenty of people who ask me questions only to launch into their own answers. Have you ever met somebody like that? You get to the other side of the question and you're like, ooh, that's a good question. I need to think about that. And you think it through and you give the most thoughtful, best possible answer you can give because you're trying to be helpful or you're trying to serve them. And you get to the other side of your answer and they're like, well, great, this is what I think. And you realize in that moment, they didn't care what you had to say to begin with. They were setting you up with a bait and switch, asking a question that they already had the answer to, and they just wanted to demonstrate it with you. In effect, you're not even necessary for that conversation. I've gotten through a lot of conversations, and I think, I wasn't even necessary here. Like, you could have had that whole talk, and I could have been over there. Like, I didn't even need to hear it. We want to be the people who are actually incredibly forgettable in a conversation other than how we make people feel. If you can get through a conversation, and somebody might not remember everything that you said, and they might be even leaving that conversation thinking like, I don't know what just happened, but I really enjoyed it and I feel good about myself. And so there's a really good chance that you had a conversation or somebody else had a conversation with someone who knows how to ask about them. And one of the simplest ways we can serve others is by asking questions about other people. Now, I know, we mentioned it last week, we are in a society where we have never had more chance to voice our needs, voice our opinions, voice our positions on things, but we have never felt less heard and seen. And already I can sense, like I know in all of us, if we take this to heart and we start learning how to ask questions more than we speak to others, we're going to start feeling like, but what about me? Who's going to ask me questions? Well, we all will. We're all going to get better at asking questions. We're all going to check in on one another. We're all going to start serving one another because we're going to learn to ask better questions about how people are. And this requires a couple things. It's going to require us to make sure that we're not initiating conversations so that we can share about something. That's a bait and switch. We're going to have to tackle issues of habits in conversation where we introduce things that we just wanted to talk about and then we talk over people. Do you know you can't find out how somebody's doing if you talk over them all the time? It doesn't work. I know in a heartbeat that if you ask me a question and then talk over me while I'm giving you the answer, you actually didn't care about the question. Now, all of us do this at some level. All of us do. I do it. You do it. Everybody does it. Everybody's thinking like, we just had the conversation. I just talked with Dan. Did I do that? I am talking about you. I'm talking about all of us. I'm talking about me. Because we all do it. We all ask a question, we get excited about something, and in innocent relationship, we get excited and we just start talking about things. We're going to have to rein that in. We have to be better about asking questions than we do about offering our opinions and offering our own stories. Just listen. Ask a question and listen. And if somebody leaves that conversation not remembering everything that you said, but knowing they feel really good about their interaction with you, you've nailed it. Another way we can serve is by finding ways to bless others. By blessing others, I'm talking about tangible acts of service. I'm talking about little things. In our household, if I hear the coffee grinder going off because Janine is making her own coffee, I've failed. If I'm home, she should never have to make her own coffee. It's one of the ways I know how to serve her. I know she likes that. And so a simple way that I can serve her is, I've just kind of vowed, if I'm available, she'll never make her own coffee. How can you serve other people? It doesn't have to be the most extravagant way possible. How can you serve other people? Did you know it's a small act of blessing? If you pass by a piece of trash in the sidewalk, you serve everybody just by throwing it away. Well, I'm too important for that. Somebody else will pick it up. That's a title. And it's in the way of your towel. If your inhibition to blessing somebody else is because that's not your role, that's not your job, I don't have time at work, that's not my job. That's true. Get rid of that title and find ways you can bless people. Because what we need in the world is more blessing and less hiding behind our titles. Hiding behind our entitlements. Not just titles, but entitlement. I'm entitled to these things. It's not my job. It's not my role. Actually, yes, it is. It is your role. Especially if you follow Jesus. If you want resilient relationships, we have to learn to find tangible ways to bless people. Getting down, serving them. Does your neighbor's yard need to be mowed? Mow it. Well, I don't have the time for that. They probably don't either, and they're going to love it. Bless. Well, what if I don't get anything out of it? That's not the point. That's using power wrong. That's becoming a benefactor. If you serve so you get something out of the relationship, that's a benefactor. That's the very definition of a benefactor. We have to learn to give of ourselves, of our time, of our actions in ways that don't require any response from the individual. If you're waiting for a thank you, you've become a benefactor. If you're waiting for repayment, you're a benefactor. You need to get rid of that title. A final way we can serve is another spoken thing, just like questions, and that's be free with your compliments. I would honestly say my wife, Janine, is so good at this, especially in public. She's so good at giving people compliments. And when I try to do it, for the most part, especially with strangers, it comes off like creepy. And when I think back, I'm like, yeah, I did that about as creepily as I could. Like, I don't think it gets much creepier than that. I'm like, I like your pants. And they're like, hey, we're moving on. Like, we gotta go. But she does it so well. And honestly, it gets her into conversations with people that she would never be in otherwise. She's built whole relationships out of it because she's really good at it. Now, one thing I know to be true is we live in a world where everyone is craving affirmation. Everyone. And I need you to hear that clearly. Everyone craves affirmation. You crave it, I crave it. And if we live in a world where everyone craves affirmation, what better way to serve people than give the affirmation and stop trying to seek it? You can't give affirmation to somebody when all you can sense is your own need for affirmation. And the only way you can deal with that is between you and the Lord. You got to figure that out between the Lord. If you can rely on Him, if you can be centered in what He speaks about you, what He thinks about you, and what He will give you, emotionally, physically, relationally, what God can provide for you, you don't need it from anybody else, and you are free to generously give compliments to anybody you come along. And now what I would say is the closer the relationship, the deeper those compliments should go. If you're dealing with a spouse, learn to give your spouse multiple compliments a day and give a range of compliments. Give surface level compliments, but then compliment their character and who they're becoming and the type of role they play in their family. Give them compliments that are deep and meaningful. Be liberal with your compliments. We're so liberal with our criticisms and so stingy with our compliments. That's a lot more like a king. That's a title that's in the way. But who's going to take care of me? That's entitlement. It has title in the word. Get rid of it. One of the ways we could take up that towel is by freely giving compliments to other people, affirming them because everyone needs affirmation. Now, I'm going to say something really hard. If you have a hard time with somebody, or you don't like somebody, or they're mean to you, you're good to do it more. And that's really hard, but I actually remember another teaching of Jesus that went something like, if somebody curses you, return it with blessing. If somebody strikes you, turn the other cheek. Well, it's really hard to do with people who are annoying, need too much from us, right? We looked at those couplets at the beginning of our time together, and one of the things when somebody is demanding too much from us, we withdraw. What if we met their demands with compliments? What if we were liberal with our words of affirmation toward other people? I think people would really like that. I think it would help build up our conversations. How many people grew up in homes, in relationship with parents, and a compliment was so hard-earned? Don't make people in your relationships earn your compliments, because you don't want that. That's not how Jesus operates. That's what the head of the table has a right to do, but you should be among others as those who serve. This is one of the ways that we fulfill what Jesus has asked us to do in being a salt and light in the world. We flavor it, we make it better, we preserve it. If you can even practice one of these things this week, if you can find ways to work out, whether it's just learning to ask better questions or blessing people or giving free compliments to people, especially those closest to you in your life, I promise you it is going to pay massive dividends in the strength and quality and the resiliency of your relationship. I promise. You could take, if I'm wrong, I want you to come and tell me. If that is an absolutely wrong thing, you can have your money back. If I'm wrong, you can scold me, you can do it, I'll let you hit me. I'll cry, but I'll let you hit me. I promise it's going to build healthier relationships. It's going to build resilient relationships. And it's not, more than that, then our relationships become a testimony to who God is and the work and ministry of Jesus in the world. It becomes a beautiful spot in the middle of a dark society. It becomes liberating in the midst of always feeling like you never have enough. Jesus said it's more blessed to give than to receive. This goes in so many different directions. Let's take it to heart when we serve others as well. That's how you become truly great in a relationship. Not by leveraging or manipulating or twisting things to your will, but by serving others. Let's pray.